The apartment door slammed shut with a finality that ripped through my chest. Ezra was gone, and in that moment, the 3 years I'd spent loving him in complete secrecy came crashing down around me. I stood there in the middle of our living room, the one we'd furnished together with careful lies about roommates, staring at the empty hook where his coat used to hang. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but what could I even say? He had made it clear this time. No more promises, no more waiting for me to be brave. The silence pressed in like a weight, and all I could think was how perfectly we'd hidden it all. The late-night dinners, the whispered I love yous, the way his laugh filled every corner of this place until now. It hadn't started like this. 3 years earlier, on a crisp autumn afternoon in Brooklyn, I had wandered into a small gallery opening after a brutal day at the firm. I was Damien Caldwell, 27, rising associate at Harlan & Associates, the kind of guy who wore tailored suits and smiled politely at client dinners while keeping every real part of himself locked away. My family back in Austin still sent me articles about good Christian girls they wanted me to meet, and the partners at work loved dropping hints about how a wife and kids rounded out a lawyer's image. Then Ezra Klein stepped into my line of sight, holding a glass of cheap wine and studying a painting like it held every secret in the world. He was 26, an illustrator with sun-streaked blonde hair that fell across his forehead and blue eyes that seemed to see straight through the armor I wore. We talked for hours that night about art and law and the city that both thrilled and terrified us. By the time the gallery lights dimmed, I had his number and a feeling I hadn't allowed myself in years. Our first real date was simple. Coffee in a quiet corner of Prospect Park, where the leaves were turning gold. Ezra told me about growing up in Seattle with parents who marched in pride parades, how he'd never had to hide. I told him the edited version, Texas family, strict expectations, a career that demanded perfection. When he leaned in and kissed me under the shade of an old oak tree, soft and certain, I felt something crack open inside me. But even then, I pulled back and whispered, "We have to be careful. My job, my parents. They wouldn't understand." He nodded, eyes soft with understanding I didn't deserve. "For now," he said. That "for now" became our quiet agreement, the one that stretched into months of stolen weekends and coded texts. By the 6-month mark, we were sharing the apartment in Williamsburg, telling the landlord and my colleagues that Ezra was just my roommate who worked odd hours. I introduced him to my few close friends as the guy crashing on my couch. At Christmas I flew home alone to Austin, smiling through my mother's questions about dating while Ezra spent the holiday with his own family, sending me photos of twinkling lights and inside jokes only we understood. The secrecy felt like a shield at first, protecting the fragile thing we'd built. But shields have edges, and they started cutting deeper every time I chose silence over truth. That first year we learned each other's rhythms. Ezra would sketch at the kitchen table while I reviewed case files late into the night, our feet tangled under the table in silent companionship. On weekends we'd drive upstate, windows down, singing off-key to whatever playlist he curated, always careful to book separate hotel rooms if we ran into anyone from the firm. One rainy Sunday in the Catskills, after we'd hiked a quiet trail and shared a thermos of coffee, he turned to me and said, "I love you, Damien. I don't need the world to know yet, but I need you to believe it." I kissed him then, tasting rain on his lips, and for a moment the weight lifted. Yet even in those bright days, cracks appeared. My sister called one evening while Ezra was cooking pasta, and I stepped into the hallway to answer, lowering my voice when she asked who was there. "Just the roommate." I lied, and when I hung up, Ezra's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He never pushed, not then. He simply handed me a plate and changed the subject to a new illustration project. I told myself it was enough. I told myself we were building something real in the shadows, that one day I'd be ready. The second year brought new pressures. The firm tapped me for a major promotion track, the kind that came with client events and expectations of a polished personal life. Partners started inviting me to barbecues with their wives and kids, asking not-so-subtle questions about settling down. At the same time, Ezra landed his first big gallery show in Soho. I attended alone, standing at the back in a baseball cap, watching him glow under the spotlights as strangers praised his work. Afterward, we celebrated in private with takeout and cheap champagne on the fire escape. His head on my shoulder while city lights twinkled below. "You should have been up there with me," he murmured. I squeezed his hand and changed the subject, but the guilt lingered like smoke. We fought for the first time that spring, not loudly but in the quiet way that hurts more. Ezra wanted to post a photo of us on his private Instagram story. Just the two of us at Coney Island, nothing obvious. I said no. What if someone from the firm sees? He stared at me for a long moment, then deleted the draft without another word. That night I lay awake listening to his even breathing, wondering how long love could survive on half measures. By the time the third year rolled around, the apartment felt smaller, the secrets heavier. Ezra's patience was thinning, though he never said it outright. Instead, he threw himself into his art, staying late at the studio, coming home with paint on his hands and stories I wasn't part of. I buried myself in work, landing the promotion but feeling emptier than ever. My mother started sending wedding invitations from cousins back home, each one a reminder of the life I was supposed to want. Ezra and I still had our moments. The quiet mornings when he'd bring me coffee in bed, the way he'd trace patterns on my back while we watched old movies, but they were laced with something unspoken, a countdown neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Then came the night everything fractured. We'd argued earlier about attending his friend's wedding together as a couple. I said it was too risky. He said he was tired of being invisible. The fight simmered through dinner until he stood up, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I can't keep pretending this is enough, Damien. I love you, but I won't be your secret forever." Before I could find the right words, he grabbed his jacket and walked out. I thought he'd come back like always. He didn't. Now the apartment echoed with absence. I sank onto the couch, the one we'd picked out together at IKEA on a Saturday when the city felt full of possibility, and let the reality settle. 3 years. 3 years of loving the brightest person I'd ever known in the dark. And now he was gone, leaving me alone with every lie I'd told to keep us safe. Little did I know the real storm was only beginning. Morning light filtered through the blinds, harsh and unforgiving, as I stared at the half-empty closet where Ezra's clothes had hung just yesterday. The faint scent of his cologne still clung to the air, a cruel reminder that this wasn't a nightmare I could wake from. I hadn't slept. Instead, I'd replayed every conversation, every careful choice that led us here, wondering where I'd gone wrong. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. Work, probably. But I ignored it. For the first time in years, the firm felt distant, irrelevant compared to the hollow ache in my chest. I forced myself to move, brewing coffee in the French press we'd bought on a whim during a weekend flea market trip. The mug felt too heavy in my hands as memories flooded back. That first Christmas after we moved in together, Ezra had surprised me with matching mugs engraved with tiny stars, our private joke about navigating the city by constellations. I'd laughed and pulled him close, promising we'd see the real ones someday far from prying eyes. Now the second mug sat untouched on the shelf, a ghost of what we'd built. Work eventually called me back. I showered, shaved, and put on the armor of my charcoal suit, the one Ezra always said made me look like I owned the world. The subway ride to Midtown was a blur of strangers and rattling tracks. At the office, Sarah from litigation cornered me by the espresso machine. "You look like hell, Caldwell. Everything okay with the roommate situation?" The word roommate twisted like a knife. I forced a smile. "Just a rough night. Deadline pressure." She nodded sympathetically and walked away, oblivious to the truth. How many times had I used that excuse? How many lies had I layered to protect something that was never truly safe? The day dragged through meetings and depositions, but my mind kept drifting to Ezra. I texted him twice, simple messages asking if he was safe, if we could talk. No reply. By evening, the silence had become its own kind of scream. I left the office early, something I never did, and wandered the streets of Williamsburg, past the coffee shop where we'd had our first real conversation after the gallery. The barista recognized me and asked about your friend. I mumbled something vague and left without ordering. Back home, the emptiness hit harder. I opened the drawer where Ezra kept his sketchbooks, the ones he never let me see until they were finished. The top one lay open to a half-completed portrait. My face, captured in soft pencil lines with an expression of quiet wonder I'd never noticed in the mirror. Underneath, he'd written a date from last summer and a single word, mine. Tears stung my eyes for the first time since he'd left. I closed the book gently, as if it might break, and sat on the floor surrounded by the fragments of our life. That night, I allowed myself the luxury of remembering how we'd almost been caught once, during my sister's surprise visit 2 years ago. She'd flown in for a conference and insisted on staying at the apartment. Ezra had slept on the couch for 3 nights while I performed the roommate charade perfectly. Separate rooms, polite small talk, no lingering touches. On the last evening, after she'd gone to bed, Ezra had pulled me into the hallway and kissed me with a desperation that said everything words couldn't. "This is killing me slowly," he'd whispered against my lips. I'd held him tighter and promised it wouldn't be forever. Looking back now, that promise felt as fragile as the paper in his sketchbook. The following weeks blurred into a routine of survival. I threw myself into a high-profile case involving corporate fraud, staying late at the office until the cleaning crew arrived. Colleagues noticed the change. Finally getting serious about partnership, one partner joked in the elevator. I smiled and nodded, all while counting the days since Ezra had walked out. 23. 23 days of radio silence. I'd driven past his new studio once, a converted warehouse in Bushwick, but hadn't had the courage to go inside. What would I say? Sorry for making you invisible? Sorry for choosing fear over us? Then came the call I dreaded most. My mother. Her voice on the line was warm and probing as always. "Damien, honey, your cousin Lauren is getting married next month. You have to bring someone special this time. The family keeps asking." I gripped the phone until my knuckles whitened. "Mom, work is crazy right now. I might not even make it." She sighed the way she always did when I disappointed her without explanation. "You can't keep putting life on hold, sweetheart. Find a nice girl, settle down. Your father and I worry." The guilt crashed over me like a wave. They didn't know about Ezra. They didn't know their son had been living a double life for 3 years with a man who made every ordinary day feel like magic. I ended the call with another vague promise and stared at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could carry the weight alone. Friends started noticing too. My college buddy Marcus invited me for beers in the East Village, and halfway through his second pint he leaned in. "Dude, you've been off since that roommate moved out. You two were tight. Everything okay?" I shrugged and changed the subject to baseball, but inside I screamed. Ezra wasn't just a roommate. He was the person who'd seen me at my most vulnerable, who'd held me through the panic attacks after bad cases, who'd made me believe I could be more than the careful version of myself I'd constructed. Without him, the world felt flat, colorless. One rainy Thursday, I finally broke. I sat on the fire escape with a bottle of the cheap red wine Ezra loved and let the tears come. The city lights blurred below, and for the first time I admitted out loud what I'd been avoiding. I had lost the best part of my life because I'd been too afraid to claim it. The question that followed terrified me most. Could I ever get it back? Or had my silence destroyed us for good? The next morning brought an unexpected knock at the door. I opened it to find Ezra's best friend Lena standing there. Rain dripping from her umbrella, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk, Damien. About what happens next." My heart stuttered. This was the beginning of the end, or maybe the beginning of something else entirely. I stepped aside and let her in, the apartment suddenly feeling smaller than ever. Lena didn't waste time. She set her umbrella in the corner and crossed her arms, water pooling on the hardwood floor we'd refinished together last spring. "He's staying with me in Bushwick." she said without preamble. And he's hurting, Damien. More than you probably realize. Her words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through every excuse I'd built. I offered her coffee, but she declined, instead pulling out her phone to show me a photo Ezra had drawn the night before. A self-portrait with hollow eyes and a faded outline of another figure beside him. He won't say it, but he still loves you. The question is whether you're willing to stop hiding long enough to meet him halfway. I sank into the chair, the same one where Ezra used to curl up with his laptop. The conversation stretched for over an hour, Lena laying out truths I'd spent 3 years avoiding. Ezra's art had suffered. His latest gallery curator noticed the shift from vibrant colors to muted grays. Friends were worried. And underneath it all was the simple fact that love in the shadows eventually starves. When she left, promising to pass along a message if I had one, I stood at the window watching the rain and realized the real collapse wasn't just Ezra leaving. It was the foundation of lies cracking beneath my feet. Work became my refuge and my prison. The promotion I'd chased for years finally materialized in a corner office with a view of the Hudson, complete with a congratulatory email from the senior partners praising my professional focus. They didn't know that focus came from avoiding the emptiness at home. During a team lunch, one of the associates, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire, mentioned hearing about some drama with your old roommate. My stomach dropped. Rumors were starting, small but spreading like cracks in ice. I laughed it off, but inside I wondered how long before someone connected the dots. That weekend I drove out to the Jersey Shore alone, the same beach town where Ezra and I had spent a secret long weekend the previous summer. We had walked the boardwalk at dusk, hands brushing but never holding, stealing kisses behind the arcade when no one was looking. Now the same Ferris wheel turned against a gray sky, and every memory felt like salt in a wound. I sat on the sand and finally allowed myself to cry properly, the sound swallowed by the waves. For the first time I questioned everything my family had taught me about who I was supposed to be. The good son. The reliable lawyer. The man who never caused trouble. What if none of those labels fit anymore? Monday brought the first real blow. My boss called me into his office and closed the door. There's talk around the water cooler, Damien, about your personal life. Clients are conservative. We need to keep things clean. He didn't say the words, but the implication was clear. Keep hiding or risk the partnership track. I nodded numbly and walked out, the promotion suddenly feeling like a golden cage. That evening I texted Ezra for the first time in weeks. I miss you. Can we meet? The reply came hours later, short and devastating. Not until you're ready to be seen. The following month passed in a haze of late nights and early mornings. I started therapy quietly through an app, sessions that left me raw and exhausted. The therapist, a kind woman with a soft voice, encouraged me to write letters I might never send. I filled pages with apologies and dreams of a future where we walked down the street holding hands without looking over our shoulders. But writing wasn't enough. I needed action even if it terrified me. My sister called again, this time with news that our father wasn't well. Nothing serious yet, but enough to pull me back to Austin for a long weekend. The trip was torture. Sitting at the family dinner table while my mother passed around photo albums of my childhood, I felt like an imposter. When she asked again about bringing someone home for Thanksgiving, I almost told her. The words hovered on my tongue. I'm in love with a man named Ezra. He's the best thing that's ever happened to me. But fear won. I mumbled something about being single and changed the subject. On the flight back to New York, I stared out the window at the clouds and realized I'd reached a breaking point. Something had to give. Ezra's silence continued, but Lena kept me updated in cryptic texts. He was working on a new series called Invisible Threads, pieces that spoke of connection and absence. One night she sent a photo of the opening night invite. Against my better judgment I went, slipping into the back of the gallery wearing a hoodie and staying in the shadows. I watched him across the room, smiling for strangers while his eyes looked tired. When our gazes met for a brief second across the crowd, The air left my lungs. He turned away first, and the rejection stung worse than any argument. The next day at work, everything imploded. Claire cornered me in the copy room and whispered, "I saw you at the gallery last night, with Ezra Klein. People are talking Damien. You might want to get ahead of it." My blood ran cold. The secret was slipping through my fingers, and Ezra wasn't even here to see the fallout. That night I sat on the fire escape again, this time with no wine, just the cold wind and the realization that hiding had never protected us. It had only delayed the inevitable. I drafted a long email to Ezra explaining everything, then deleted it. Words weren't enough anymore. I needed to show him I was changing, even if it meant losing everything else. The decision crystallized in the quiet hours before dawn. I would come out at work. I would tell my family. And then I would find him and beg for another chance. But life, as always, had other plans. The email from HR arrived at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that already felt cursed. Mandatory meeting at 10 regarding workplace conduct. My stomach twisted as I read the subject line again. Claire's warning echoed in my head, but I hadn't expected it to move this fast. I spent the next hour rehearsing explanations in the bathroom mirror, practicing the words I'd avoided for 3 years. When I walked into the conference room, 3 partners sat waiting, faces professionally blank. "We've received concerns about your personal relationships potentially affecting client perception," the senior partner began. No names were mentioned, but the message was unmistakable. They weren't firing me yet, but the partnership offer was on hold pending clarity. I left the meeting numb. The city outside the windows suddenly too bright, too loud. Word spread faster than I could contain it. By lunch, my inbox filled with concerned messages from colleagues who suddenly remembered that roommate and wanted details. I ignored them all and went home early, the apartment feeling both sanctuary and prison. That's when the second blow landed. My mother called, voice trembling. "Damien, your cousin forwarded me something from Instagram. A post about an artist named Ezra Klein and pictures from years ago. Is this true?" Someone, maybe a mutual acquaintance, had pieced together old stories and posted vague but damning hints. The secret was out, not with fanfare but with whispers that reached all the way to Texas. My father got on the line next, his disappointment a physical weight. "We raised you better than this. Come home and we'll figure it out." I hung up shaking. The carefully constructed life I'd built now rubble around me. That evening I drove to Bushwick, heart hammering as I parked outside Lena's building. Ezra opened the door after the third knock, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into guarded caution. We stood in the hallway for a long moment, neither speaking. Finally he stepped aside and let me in. The small apartment smelled of turpentine and fresh coffee, familiar yet foreign. "I didn't want it to come out like this," I said, voice cracking. "None of it." He listened as I poured out the details, the meeting at work, the family call, the way everything I'd hidden was now public property. When I finished he sat quietly, then said the words that cut deepest. "I waited 3 years for you to choose us, Damien. Now the world chose for you, and I'm not sure that's the same thing." We talked until dawn, circling the pain and the love that refused to die. He told me about the nights he'd almost called, the sketches he'd destroyed in frustration, the way he'd started therapy too. I admitted my fears weren't just about family or career, they were about losing the version of myself I'd been raised to be. For the first time we spoke without the filter of secrecy, raw and honest. When morning light crept through the blinds, he took my hand. "I still love you, but I need time, and you need to figure out who you are without the hiding." I left with a fragile hope and the knowledge that rebuilding would be harder than starting over. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in consequences. The firm placed me on administrative leave while we evaluate. Clients pulled back. My sister sent long texts alternating between confusion and support. My mother stopped answering calls altogether. I moved my things into a smaller studio in Queens, the kind of place Ezra would have loved for its light. Nights were the hardest, waking to reach for him and finding empty space. But something shifted in the emptiness. I started running in the mornings, joining a local LGBTQ support group on Thursday evenings, listening to strangers share stories that mirrored my own. For the first time, I spoke my truth out loud in a room full of people. My name is Damien, and I spent 3 years hiding the man I love. The words didn't break me. They freed something. Ezra and I met twice more, coffee in neutral cafes where we talked about everything except us. He was preparing for a new show in Chicago, a chance to leave the city and the memories behind. I didn't ask him to stay. Instead, I told him I was proud of him, that his art deserved to be seen everywhere. The pride in his eyes when he thanked me felt like the first genuine light in months. Then came the call from my father. Not angry this time, but tired. Your mother is hurting, son. But so are we all. Maybe it's time we talked face to face. I booked a ticket to Austin for the following weekend, knowing the conversation would either mend or sever the last ties. As the plane lifted off, I stared at the shrinking city lights and realized the collapse wasn't the end. It was the beginning of whatever came next. Back in Texas, the house felt smaller than I remembered. My parents sat across the kitchen table, coffee growing cold while I spoke for nearly 2 hours. I told them about meeting Ezra, about the love that had carried me through the hardest years, about the fear that had kept me silent. My mother cried. My father stared at his hands. When I finished, there was a long silence before he said, "We don't understand it all, but you're still our son." It wasn't acceptance. Not yet. But it was a crack in the wall I'd feared for years. That night in my childhood bedroom, I texted Ezra a single photo of the Texas sky at sunset with the caption, "Taking my first real steps into the light." His reply came quickly, a simple heart emoji. Small but enough. The return to New York brought more changes. The firm offered a quiet settlement and a neutral reference rather than a fight. I took it and started freelancing, the freedom both terrifying and exhilarating. Friends I'd lost touch with reached out, some awkward, some genuinely supportive. Marcus showed up at my door one evening with beer and a willingness to listen. Slowly, piece by piece, I rebuilt a life that didn't require hiding. Yet through it all, Ezra remained the missing color. I didn't push, but I hoped. Then one crisp October morning, my phone rang with an unknown Chicago number. Ezra's voice on the other end carried a smile I hadn't heard in months. "My show opens next week. There's a ticket with your name on it if you want to be seen with me this time." I laughed through sudden tears and said yes before he could change his mind. As I booked the flight, I realized the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning to feel like home. Chicago in November carried a bite to the air that reminded me of our first winter together, when we'd huddled under blankets watching snow fall on the Williamsburg rooftops. I arrived the day before the opening, heart racing as the taxi pulled up to the gallery in the West Loop. Ezra met me outside, scarf wrapped tight, blonde hair tousled by the wind. We didn't hug immediately, just stood there taking each other in, the months of distance melting under the weight of eye contact. "You came," he said softly. "Of course I did," I replied, and for the first time in years the words didn't carry any qualifiers. The opening night was everything his talent deserved. The gallery buzzed with critics and collectors, but my eyes stayed on Ezra as he moved through the crowd with quiet confidence. His new series, bold canvases exploring visibility and shadow, hung like windows into the journey we'd both survived. One piece in particular stopped me cold. 2 figures standing back to back, one stepping into light while the other lingered in gray. The title card read simply "Threads." When he found me staring at it later, he slipped his hand into mine right there in front of everyone. No flinch, no glance over the shoulder. Just us. The feeling was dizzying, like breathing clean air after years underground. We spent the weekend walking Chicago streets, talking about everything we'd missed. He told me about the therapy that helped him set boundaries. I shared how freelancing had given me space to breathe and even start writing a little on the side. We laughed about the ridiculous rumors that had followed me out of the firm, and we cried over the strained calls with my family that were slowly improving. One evening over deep dish pizza, he looked at me across the table and said, "I don't want to go back to how it was, Damien, but I want to go forward with you, if you're ready to live in the open." I took his hand and promised, this time without hesitation, that I was. Returning to New York together felt like closing a circle and opening a new one. We found a larger apartment in Queens with a studio space for him and an office nook for me. The move was public. Ezra posted a simple photo of us unpacking boxes with the caption "New Chapter, No More Hiding." The responses poured in. Support from his art community, cautious messages from my old colleagues, and eventually a long email from my mother asking for photos of the place. Small steps, but forward. Work evolved too. I started consulting for smaller firms that valued authenticity over image, and surprisingly several clients sought me out after hearing my story through the grapevine. One afternoon, a young associate from my old firm reached out privately, confessing his own struggles and asking for advice. I met him for coffee and shared what I'd learned, that hiding never protects anyone, least of all yourself. The conversation left me lighter, proof that my collapse had created space for others to rise. Family visits remained complicated. My parents flew up for a cautious weekend, staying in a hotel rather than our place at first. Dinner was awkward but honest. My father asked Ezra about his art. My mother complimented the way he made me laugh. They didn't fully understand, but they tried, and that effort meant more than perfect acceptance ever could. My sister even FaceTimed from Austin to say she was proud of me for finally choosing happiness. The healing wasn't linear. There were still tense holidays and unanswered questions, but it was real. Ezra's career continued its upward trajectory. A major museum in Los Angeles acquired one of his pieces, and we celebrated with a quiet dinner on our new balcony overlooking the East River. As city lights reflected on the water, he turned to me and said, "Thank you for fighting for us, even when it broke everything first." I kissed him then, openly and without fear, and realized the man I'd become through the pain was someone I could finally be proud of. Yet life has a way of testing growth. 6 months after our reunion, a former partner from the firm reached out with an offer to return in a senior role, on the condition that I kept my personal life discreet for client relations. The email sat in my inbox for days while I wrestled with old fears. Ezra never pressured me. He simply reminded me that I already knew the answer. In the end, I declined politely, choosing the freedom I'd fought so hard to claim. The decision felt like the final piece clicking into place. Through it all, we built new traditions. Sunday brunches with friends who knew us as a couple, weekend drives where we held hands openly on the highway, quiet evenings where we talked about the future without shadows. Ezra started a series inspired by our story. Bright, hopeful pieces that captured light breaking through cracks. When he asked me to model for one, I agreed without hesitation. Sitting in the studio while he sketched, sunlight streaming across us both. The journey hadn't been easy. There were still nights when old doubts crept in, when a judgmental glance on the subway made my stomach tighten. But each time Ezra would squeeze my hand and I'd remember, we'd survived the collapse. We were building something stronger in its place. And for the first time I understood that love isn't about perfection or protection. It's about showing up fully, every single day, no matter who sees. Spring arrived in New York with the kind of sudden warmth that makes the whole city feel alive again. Cherry blossoms lined the streets near our building, and Ezra and I spent Saturday mornings walking through them hand in hand, no longer glancing over our shoulders. His latest exhibition opened at a prestigious gallery in Chelsea, and this time I stood beside him at the opening as his partner. Publicly, proudly, introducing myself to collectors and critics without hesitation. The pride in his eyes when he watched me do it was worth every hard step that had led us here. My own path continued to unfold in unexpected ways. I launched a small legal consultancy focused on supporting LGBTQ-owned businesses, drawing on everything I'd learned about living authentically. Clients came not just for contracts but for the understanding that came from someone who'd walked through fire and chosen truth. One afternoon, a young lawyer fresh out of school sat across from me and asked how I'd found the courage to start over. I told him the truth. Courage wasn't something I had, it was something the collapse forced me to grow. He left with more than legal advice, he left with hope. Family ties strengthened slowly but surely. My parents visited again in May, this time staying in the guest room we'd prepared. My mother helped Ezra in the kitchen while they talked about art and recipes. My father and I watched a baseball game in comfortable silence broken by occasional questions about my new work. When they left, my mother hugged me tightly and whispered, "We're learning, sweetheart. Keep sending pictures." It wasn't everything, but it was enough to keep building on. My sister even brought her husband to New York for a weekend, and the four of us shared laughter over dinner like any other family. The acceptance I'd once feared would never come was arriving in its own time, shaped by patience and persistence. Ezra and I took our first real vacation together that summer, a week in the Pacific Northwest where his family still lived. We flew into Seattle and spent days hiking through rainforests, holding hands on trails where no one cared who we were. His parents welcomed me with open arms and stories about Ezra as a boy, and for the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere without reservation. One evening around a campfire, his mother said quietly, "Thank you for loving him enough to fight for the light." I looked across the flames at Ezra and knew every sacrifice had been worth it. Back in the city, life settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Mornings started with coffee on the balcony while Ezra sketched and I reviewed case notes. Evenings often ended with friends gathered around our table, conversations flowing freely about art, law, love, and everything in between. We adopted a rescue dog named Atlas, a goofy mutt who somehow knew when one of us needed extra snuggles after a hard day. Small rituals wove themselves into our days. Sunday farmers markets, Tuesday movie nights, the way we'd always kiss goodbye in the doorway, no matter how short the separation. One crisp October evening, exactly 3 years after that door had slammed shut, we found ourselves back in Prospect Park where our first date had happened. Leaves crunched under our feet as we walked the familiar path. Ezra stopped under the same old oak tree and turned to me, eyes shining with the same certainty I'd seen that very first time. From his pocket, he pulled a simple silver band. "Damien Caldwell, will you marry me? Not in secret, not someday, but right here in the open where everyone can see how much I love you?" Tears blurred my vision as I said yes, pulling him into a kiss that felt like coming home after the longest journey. The park lights twinkled around us, and for once I didn't care who saw. The wedding was small and perfect, held the following spring in a sunlit Brooklyn loft with close friends, chosen family, and my parents sitting proudly in the front row. Ezra wore a charcoal suit that matched the one I'd worn the day we met. I wore a tie he'd painted by hand with tiny constellations. When we exchanged vows, there were no shadows, only light streaming through tall windows and the sound of our friends cheering as we kissed. My father shook Ezra's hand afterward with genuine warmth, and my mother danced with both of us at the reception. The moment felt like the final proof that collapse can sometimes be the beginning of everything beautiful. Looking back now, years later, I see how every painful step led us here. To a life where love isn't hidden but celebrated, where identity isn't a secret but a strength. Ezra still creates art that moves people. I still fight for justice in ways that matter. Together we've built something neither of us could have imagined in those early days of fear and silence. The boy who once hid in shadows now stands in sunlight, hand in hand with the man who taught him how to shine. And yet the story continues because growth never really ends. We still face the world's judgments sometimes, still navigate family complexities, still choose each other every single day. But we do it together, openly, honestly, and with a love that survived its greatest test. Is it possible for a love that begins in secrecy to become the foundation for a life lived fully in the light? True or false?